Welcome to the Debt, Taxes and Chains podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life meets the uncertainty of discussion. And today we are really privileged to have with us in the studio the hosts of the North-South podcast. Welcome here, guys.
Thank you very much for having us on.
Thanks for having us on, gentlemen.
It's such a privilege to have you guys here. So perhaps just to kick off, I think this is a good opportunity for you guys to punt your podcast a bit. Just tell us a bit more. How did it start and where are you guys at this moment?
Well, yeah, we kind of just started it out of a passion. We enjoy speaking to one another, and we thought, our discussions on that could probably turn into a podcast. So that's exactly what we did. We've been around only for about a month and a half now. We started in the beginning of January of 2019. I think we've done 10 full podcasts so far, and we've managed to get some biggish South African names on already, with the likes of Ronaldo Gous, Ramon Cabernac, and Joe Cran, which is sporting side of things. And we just want to create a platform where we're able to cover things that we are interested in, and have a range of different perspective and views and walks of life all in one place.
Yeah, just to add on to what Darren said, obviously we are quite new, and we're quite shocked at how quickly it's taken off in terms of our understanding of how it worked. We even said to each other, if we get no views, it's all right. At least, we're having fun making it. And I think if you start off with that attitude, people are bound to pick that up, that you're sort of speaking from the heart, because Darren and I thought going into it, there'll be a lot of editing, but it turns out we actually don't edit the episodes. Darren, if I'm correct, I don't think we've actually ever edited from the time we start to stop.
Well, yeah, we just edit like the first few minutes and that you don't...
Yeah.
Talking rubbish and that, and then the last few, but in between it's pretty much cut and paste.
Yeah.
So obviously every podcaster and every podcast wants to add something to the world. You want to leave a mark, you want to have a legacy, you want people to say, oh, that podcast is really the authority on libertarian thinking, or on conservative thinking, or on far leftist Marxist thinking, or whatever that may be, or on rugby and the role of a number 6 flank or whatever. What would you say you guys have in mind when it comes to legacy, when it comes to leaving your mark?
Well, I think, like I said, we want to have a platform where, there's different walks of life and plenty of views and perspectives, and whether we enjoy sport, whether it be political, whether it be just environmental. So the main goal I want from the podcast is to get people thinking, maybe thinking down lines that they wouldn't initially think. So I wouldn't say that, or from our side, that we have a particular angle that we work on, but we'd rather just let people make their own conclusions and their own thoughts, and use the podcast just as a platform to learn and expand on certain topics.
Yeah, I think for myself, politically, Darren and I, we have similar views, but I think for us, we saw there was a niche. A lot of people online are either going hard right or hard left, and both come with their difficulties. And we thought to ourselves, well, we look at the world today, we thought, well, Scandinavia is a good example, but they obviously heading, from being a good example, you head either towards being far right or towards far left. There's no country that's stable. It's always dynamic. So we thought to ourselves, if we could sort of just be the podcast that takes a breath and get some common sense into it and sort of give our opinion from that basis. I thought if we could just sort of give that ideology perhaps to a few people, it would help them navigate the difficult dynamic way the world works today.
What I have to say, what I like about your podcast and especially your Twitter, because I haven't followed your Facebook page yet, and I only learned about it now, so I'll definitely go do that. But what I like about your Twitter, for example, is you guys post about football, which is awesome. I mean, it's something that you don't really see. I mean, usually podcasts tend to be like another podcast that we do weekly is a political podcast, and it's really, hardcore, just politics. And I like that angle from you guys. It's not just politics. It's everyday life sort of people, which I like. I think you support the wrong teams. I think you should all be Gunners fans in any case. But no, it's so cool, and it's quite refreshing, I think. And I think that's probably the niche that you're talking about that people really enjoy.
Yeah, and I think, we do, well, me and Alister both love sport. So we kind of basing the podcast on our likes and dislikes and all that kind of stuff. So we try and make it welcoming to everyone, whether people would want to listen to. We have sports-based podcasts, or we have political-based podcasts. So there's a bit of everything for everyone.
Yeah, well, except I think Ramon probably wouldn't like the sports part so much. He's not the biggest sports.
Yeah, I didn't have to tell him about that. I left that all out.
So if you guys, you obviously live in different parts of the world, completely different parts of the world with different things going on. How do you make sure that the things that you discuss sort of remain interesting in the sense that it doesn't go so far away from each other? It could easily happen probably that the themes happening in KZN and the UK, for instance, are so far from each other that the points of reference and the points of contact become few, far in between, and repetitive. But somehow you guys have kept it interesting and light. What do you have a secret recipe, or is it just friends chatting with each other?
I think I've still got majority of my family is still based in KZN and Joburg and the Free States, so I speak to them quite frequently, and I get a bit of perspective from them of what's happening in the country. I do tend to follow other South African-based podcasts and that as well, and get news from them, and it kind of build my opinion and my thoughts off what from those different sources, and then I generally do just keep in touch with the South African landscape, and then we do touch on things that happen in the UK, which mainly surrounds Brexit at the moment, so it gets quite boring quite quickly.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, Alister?
Yeah, I think being north-south, it's a good litmus test. If I bring up something that has no sort of pertinence to his side of the world at all, he'd sort of tell me about it, and vice versa. But I think when we had Ronaldo Gos on our show recently, he touched on a very good point about expats and about South Africans in general. I think when Darren and I were starting out, the north-south aspect, we were generally heading towards the expats, because we know there's hundreds of thousands of them in the UK, and we know that they sort of appreciate a South African's take on things. But then you get people in South Africa, they're not really privy to having Google accounts and subscribing, so they might just log onto a free Wi-Fi in public and sort of go on and watch a video or two. And we knew that it being South African would resonate with them as well. So I think,
that's so cool. So, gents, getting to the more philosophical part of this interview and discussion, perhaps, what do you? So obviously, I think your Twitter bio says you like liberty and all these lovely things. But how would you, if you had to self-describe, politically speaking, how do you guys identify, or if you don't necessarily want to put a label on it, where are you politically?
I would say I'm probably a classical
our political
liberal.
Test, Darren.
Yeah, we did a podcast a few weeks back. I don't know if you've seen it before. You can do it on, and it asks about, I think, 60 to 80 questions, and it kind of just gives you an indication of where you lie on the spectrum. And I think it worked pretty well for us. And I've pretty much seen myself as a classical liberal for the last few years. And that's pretty much where I lie. I like the idea of freedoms of speech, freedom of trade, freedom. The less government involved, the better. So sometimes when you do hear the likes of Ramon speak on the Renegade Report, some of his ideologies do make me think more down the anarchist line. But in general, I would say a classical liberal with
if I can just feed off that political test we did, I remember they marking it on a graph with 4 axes, one being the social aspect of governance and one being the economic aspect of it. And I think that's very important, because trying to get that balance is difficult, because one sort of feeds off the other. The financial aspect is used to feed the social side of things. So I think if we look at, I can't quite remember Darren's position, but my position in terms of the economy was very capitalist. So I think obviously capitalist in terms of making that extra money to have movement within the fiscal is important, but what you actually do with that the next sort of axis, is that are you going to spend that on social consumption, or are you actually going to spend that on capital investment, which is what you ideally need for economic growth. So I think for me personally, it would stem from my education in economics and so on and so forth. So for me, I'd be a hardline capitalist, but I do see a space for a social net, which sort of puts me towards the central, slightly left side, being socially.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's interesting always for me, because these tests are usually, they're quite interesting and obviously fun, and people like to post it on Facebook, and it's always a good talking point. But it's funny for me always if you think about the Conservative Party in the UK. I mean, if you say traditionally they're pro markets, they're capitalists in that sense, and you would probably say the equivalent of, the classically liberal, or maybe even conservative party. But the point is, if something like the NHS in the UK is untouchable on both sides of the spectrum. I mean, Labour, the Lib Dems, or the Conservatives will never touch the NHS. But if you ask any classical liberal, or you ask a capitalist, they'll say, listen, like public health, like care like this is a stupid idea.
Yeah, that's something I was quite taken aback by when I stepped foot in the UK, because personally I think privatizing healthcare here would be a huge benefit to everyone here. But people I've spoken to are like you say, very hard line on their NHS, and it's like a national treasure to them. Although sometimes it fails, and understaffed and under budgeted, way too many people going through the hospitals and clinics and that. People still love their NHS. So it was quite a thing to take in and recognize. But I think it's just been from a historic point of view, when the NHS was formed and that period. And I think the people have just grown up with it as being this way, and they don't know anything different from it.
The only way I'm able to explain it to myself sitting here on the sunny shores of South Africa is that it has to be, like you said, because of the time that it was created. It was just post the Second World War. It was kind of, I think it was a symbolic system for a lot of people, and they really, I mean, they tried for years to try to get it off and get it working, and it's probably that reason why. It's so untouchable. I wonder often if the UK will reach a point where they say, listen, but we don't need this anymore. But it will probably happen incrementally or gradually. I can't imagine it just any party coming in and just sweeping it away. I don't doubt that it would ever work that way.
I think. When it comes to the NHS, if I can just give my outside opinion, because obviously South Africa is looking at promulgating the National Health Act, where they'll offer that to everyone. I think that it's very important. Well, they'll try, exactly. Yeah, they'll try their best to do that. I think if you look at it, it's like a clashing of two different mindsets. So one, you get, it's obviously it becomes a major percentage of the budget being spent on it, and the second mindset is ethics. Should you let someone die when you can save them? And I think with that, you have to admit to yourself that there's always going to be a clash and there have to be a trade-off. But I think that the important thing is, and I think this is what makes me slightly get pulled away from the far left, is that I think that if you have self-responsibility in certain situations, you can work yourself into a situation where you can either have a savings for health, or you can get yourself health insurance, and that will afford you to get private healthcare, or a substandard government healthcare. Now, like people like Ben Carson in the United States, he's an African American. He's someone who's grew up in poverty. He's become a specialist surgeon. He even says that for living under social welfare, you can't make it too easy, because then the incentive to come out is not there. So I think it's sort of, that's a trade-off for an outside opinion on it.
So if we see taxes as Well, obviously it's compulsory and you have to pay it. And the more taxes you pay, which we are currently doing, sort of the more the government empowers itself. And in South Africa, we see this move to the left. But another thing that's interesting for me, and it's already happened in the UK, and we've seen in South Africa politicians speaking about it, is this idea of weapons. Now, obviously, that's a major issue in the world right now. And I think maybe a year or two ago, it was even more of an issue. But in terms of the government disempowering you, I would say that's a major move. And what frightens me is that South Africa tends to replicate British legislation, or at least it tries. Do you guys think that in terms of taxes, in other words, speaking about the government using its mighty power over us, we could see the South African government moving towards that?
No, we're going to ban knives, like in the UK.
Ban knives in Joburg.
Yeah, that's quite a funny one. Where the London mayor, I think a few months back, wanted everyone to be searched for a knife. So you couldn't carry any form of knife in London, which was quite hilarious.
Knife-free London.
But it's quite a tricky one. Maybe Alister wants to go. You can take that one.
I think it basically boils down to two things for me. You have a first world country like Britain who's been functioning for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you get a newly formed democracy like ours. They sort of have their money backed by gold to a certain aspect. They're one of the most stable currencies in the world. I think they're at a stage where people want to go there and do business, and they don't need them. We're at a different stage. We're a developing economy. The more incentive we can create for companies to come here, the more we should. I think we have the third or fourth, if I'm not mistaken, highest tax rate in Africa. I think one or two crazy countries like Tanzania like to push it up to the high 30s. But I think we really are prime destination. I lived for 5 months up in Gauteng, and I've also lived in Australia as well. And if I draw parallels for the two, I wouldn't see why a company wouldn't want to come do business. But then you look at the incentives. Well, to a certain extent, I have to give some political parties the props for mentioning special economic tax zones, because that really is something that we don't utilize well enough in this country. But I think that emulating a country that's at a different stage of developed democracy is always a problem. And when it comes to taxes must be a very personal decision between the finance governance of the country and the people that live in the country. So you have a majority of people that live below a line. It's above the poverty line, but most people would say, you could be living more comfortably. I think to start indirectly taxing them through a 1% increase in VAT, the ridiculous levy that they just put on the petrol again, as if they don't hear our outcries, as if just sort of disregard for it. I think it's a problem. We should create our own sort of tax laws based on how our people feel.
And if I can add as well, it's just onto what Alister said, there's that the UK and South Africa is quite different in the sense of employment. If you just look at the numbers of people employed here, it's in the high 90s. I think the UK's got about a 7% unemployment rate or so. Whereas you look in South Africa, you're ranging anything between 28.
It's 27.7 now,
Yeah, and with youth unemployment nearly reaching 45% or so.
55 actually.
Okay, worse. So there's a lot more people here in the middle class, I'd say, that are that pay their taxes and that. So you do have a much higher amount of people to get taxes from, for one. And I think the tax brackets here I think there's three main tax brackets. I think the first one's 20%, then about 30% or so, and the next one, the highest one's 45%. So I think it's quite similar to South Africa. I think South Africa has probably got a few more brackets in there. But the amount of people here that do pay taxes enables the economy or the government, should I say, to do a lot more with it. And there's just so many different dynamics to look at it. Obviously, the UK has got 70 odd million people, so it's higher than South Africa's population. But generally, the amount of revenue and funds here in the UK allows the government to do more, I think.
Yeah. So, gents, perhaps moving over to a bit of a different topic in this sense, but still staying on the politics. How did your, I almost want to say, live view feed into your political view? I think for a lot of people, perhaps it starts the other way around. They have a political philosophy, and then they try to kind of get their life philosophy around that. Other people would say, their faith forms their politics or whatever. How would you say did you guys get to your respective positions as a classical liberal, or as someone like you said who says you're very centered to a certain extent but very capitalist in the economic sense?
Well, I think for me it was in high school and that I didn't really care or think about politics too much. Only when I started university did I start thinking about things a bit more internally and that, and where I lie and what do I see myself? Where would I put myself on the spectrum? And probably only to near the end of my 4-year degree did I actually have some sense of where I lie. And it's probably only in a year or two after that did I really feel like classical liberal really fits me well, just from podcasts I've listened to and reading different articles, texts, and all that kind of stuff, that I really gauged where I lay, and where my views and we're on that spectrum.
For me, it was very organic. So I never once said I'm going to emulate someone or follow my forefathers in their thinking, or maybe my peers or anything like that. I just I went with my natural feeling, and I think that's important for the age that I am now. I'm almost 27. When I look back, I see now why a lot of the very far left mindsets come from the universities. I think when a person is young, they have the mindset that they can change the world, and when one wants to do that, it's often for the better. So if you're trying to say, everyone will have universal income, everyone will have healthcare, why wouldn't it seem good to someone whose mindset is to ideally change the world? So I wouldn't want to say to a certain extent, I also felt as if maybe going forward, the harms of capitalism would sort of, become more apparent to us, that rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. But I think as I grew older and I understood the hardships of having to work, of having to pay taxes, spending 30% of your day working and besides not having a say in how it gets spent, sort of not seeing it spent properly, and there's not much you can do about it. I think once you learn that, you understand how certain people can feed off the hard work of other people. Literally, you sort of have to work those hard days when you're out of university. So I think for me, that's sort of what drove me. And I think I'm a very open-minded person now, so I'd sort of vote for any sort of party that would appeal to me at this very moment in time. Very ambivalent as well, because it's a very dynamic government at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I read an interesting article, I think it was last week, where the writer argues that Marxism has sort of taken on a religious, angle to a lot of young people who really, I want to say, fall into this socialist ideology. It becomes a religion. It becomes something that you strive towards. You strive towards this utopian ideal. You strive towards the equality that Marx and Engels and Hegel talks about. And that this writer argued that it sort of took the place for a lot of young people of religion.
Yeah, I think it probably from the perspective, the socialist perspective, it would, because of what the socialism preaches, and that of pretty much caring for everyone and trying to better everyone's life together evenly.
I think it's a very easy substitute for them, because obviously if we look at graphs of religion, we look in most first world countries, we see the graph of atheism sort of rising. Well, not sort of atheism, more sort of agnostic belief, or sort of distancing themselves from a particular religion or God. I think if we look at how that's tending, we can sort of say to ourselves, there's obviously a group of, because every other group growing up has sort of had an identity that fell upon them. Now when you're choosing your own, it's the ideal gap. It's sort of why the propaganda work. People are yearning for something. But I think a lot of the dangers of socialism and of communism are not really preached, because if I remember my high school education correctly in South Africa, in history, it was sort of World War II. It was sort of the French Revolution, and that didn't really speak to the major catastrophes of the Soviet Union, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's very true. Like it's. I remember when I was in high school and I took history until matric. The closest we got to that was literally the Cuban Revolution. I think it was the Cuban Revolution or the invasion of the Bay of Pigs or whatever. That was about it. That was about as close. And I think the Russian Revolution. I remember somewhere along the line we did the glorious Russian Revolution.
And I mean, it's quite interesting that these policies that have been tried and have failed are being repackaged and are being retried. We see literally, and it's not even like we have to go through history books. We can see what's happening in Venezuela, and that's just one country. People are going like, look at Venezuela. We forget Zim was 17 years ago. Well, I mean, obviously it started before that. The thing is, if you do not, and obviously leaning too far right has its impacts, like you rightly said earlier. But if you do not respect property rights, that's a very, very basic thing. But it's one tiny little thing that a lot hinges on. And we can see, and it's the most interesting thing that all of a sudden in the USA, a country that has prided itself on freedom, you get people speaking out and saying, yeah, well, is it really that important? We want a form of socialism. That's crazy. We can see what it has done. I've always said that essentially people just use the word socialist because they want a scientific reason to take stuff from other people. What else is it? I'm being drastic, but we see that failing, and yet you don't have Julius Malema or even the ANC speaking out against it. That's disappointing, but I digress.
Yeah, because real socialism hasn't been tried yet. So
of course,
so it's. I think from the American perspective, it's probably that the majority of people that are speaking up against current regime and that and current way of things is probably a lot of young folk that 20s, 30s that might be a bit naive to the time previous, and they have no clue what it was like when the world wars were around, when Fidel Castro was in Cuba, and so forth. So I think they may take it for granted what they have, and I think, there's still obviously those diehard socialist, communist people that are maybe a bit more skillful in their methods now at repackaging their different ideology into something that's more digestible for current populace, whether it be in South Africa or in Africa, Asia, where they are able to mold Marxist theories to a specific country, and that where it may be easier to slip it in.
If I can just quickly add to what Darren said, I think it's very important in the US. For me personally, I think that ideology comes from ignorance. I think that in general, that country hasn't really felt a sting of having a policy go wrong to where it crumbles. I don't think they've ever had that, actually. So in a way, as Darren mentioned, they haven't had the wars, they haven't had those things. And I think to a bigger extent, they haven't had Venezuela or Zimbabwe happen in any of their states. So they don't know the true sting of going to bed hungry, or the true sting of watching your currency collapse and watching the people you love and the entire country collapse, and how that devastates, well, obviously not their surrounding countries, as the entire world. They will affect the entire world if they go anywhere near socialism.
Yeah, no doubt. No, definitely. Jen, so just moving into the last part perhaps of the podcast, and this interview, and I think we're definitely going to have to do a second one, because 40 minutes is never long enough to have these wonderful discussions. So you two are sitting on two separate ends of the world, and but you're obviously both. I think it's fair to say that you guys are invested and interested in South Africa, and that you care about what happens here. Otherwise, you guys wouldn't be talking about the politics and the dynamics here. What do you see in the future for South Africa? Are you guys hopeful for the next 10 years, or is it all doom and gloom like I think sometimes I feel, especially when I go onto Twitter?
I feel I'm internally a very optimistic person, so I do always hold the hope that South Africa will have its turnaround at some point in my heart. But I'm also realistic to what is actually happening. And with the likes of the ANC at the helm and the the threat of the rising of the EFF, and that just those two parties or a coalition between those two could spell doom for the nation for decades, if not longer, ahead. But I still do hold hope that podcasts like this, where ideologies are spoken about and we're free to speak our minds, and that and things like this will get out to more people as data and becomes cheaper in the country, as Wi-Fi and internet connections are increasing across the nation. So I'm hopeful that these ideology conversations and the like are able to spread, and people are able to maybe learn a bit more about people or ideologies, ideologues that they previously haven't thought about.
I think I have to agree with Darren. We share a lot of the same sentiment when it comes to the future of South Africa. I think that we grew up in a time where the dream of the Rainbow Nation was a very real idea. We saw economic growth, we saw reconciliation, but obviously we've lost 9 or 10 years to a specific individual who did this country very wrong. I think that with our positive view does come a few cardinal sins that a country can commit to definitely erode that to a base level of perhaps a Zimbabwe level. And I think one of them is the land rights, because that's fundamentally built into whether you capital or whether you socialist. I think once you do that, we've heard Julius Malema say some very scary and very dangerous things on television, where he says how he's going to you come to him and you say what you want to do with the land, and then they'll decide. That they'll decide thing is just more corruption. It's only their friends and only their family that's going to get the land. Don't the people see this? It was never ever about helping them. So I think fundamentally that's one of the cardinal sins this country will end up committing. That will be the end of all of our dream. I think if we manage to navigate that, which I thought the ANC did with the willing buyer, willing seller, I think if we don't recreate the wheel in terms of that, we can maybe navigate it. I think another cardinal sin would probably be holding people accountable, even if they're president or not. We saw Robert Mugabe get his mansion and he's free to sort of go off into the sunset with these millions. I don't think we should allow that to happen here. I think fundamentally it's you want to talk about things that hurt the soul of the people. That's something that hurts the soul of the people, not who lived where 4 generations ago. You know what I'm saying? So I think if we navigate those cardinal sins, I think there's a bright future for South Africa, because I have seen functioning economic hubs. I have seen an economy work in certain regions. I've seen the Western Cape to a certain extent. And I think if we can just emulate those sort of good things and stay away from the bad things and the cardinal sins, I think we'll be fine.
Yeah. So, and then, gents, lastly, we have an election coming up. Do you guys have any predictions? Do you guys are you betting men? Are you willing to perhaps say what you guys will think will happen?
You want to look into the shining glass ball?
Yeah.
I consult my magic 8 ball.
Yeah, it's with this one. I think it's we our first podcast was actually on some predictions and that for the 2019 general elections. And I think it's not going to be too outrageous in the polls and that. I think it's seems to be some consensus that the ANC will drop some percentage points. I roughly see them around the 57-58% mark, and also the consensus on the EFF growing. So I see the EFF probably maybe picking up some of the ANC the lost support there, so they might get it. I don't think they'll get double in size, maybe 10 to 12%, if that. I think the likes of the VBS scandal and that is still hurt the EFF with probably some of the more rural communities that they preach to. And with regards to like the DA, I'm a bit lost with the DA. I don't know where they're heading. I don't know if they know where they're heading.
I don't think they know.
Yeah, so I don't think I could see myself voting for them. So that's one less voter for them. And I think they'll probably stay stagnant. Probably that 20 to 22%, if they're lucky. And then the smaller parties might steal a few voters here and there, the likes of Cope and that. But I don't see any big shocks.
Yeah, I think I agree much with Darren in the sense that I think the ANC will likely stay the same. I think the reason they won't drop majorly is because who's leading the party. I think a lot of people will vote for the man rather than the party. And if you look at the DA, I think even after speaking to Ronaldo, I think Darren and I are still quite confused as to where they stand on certain issues. It's quite confusing. Worryingly, I don't agree with Darren and the EFF. I think they'll basically double from what they had in the first elections. And I say that based on the type of propaganda tactics that Julius Malema is using, basically releasing a 173-page manifesto of just gift giving. Basically would spur anyone without at least a first-year university education in economics to really run to the poll and vote for them, because who wouldn't? And I think it's one person to blame for that, and that's the man. He knows exactly what he's doing, and it's very wrong, because his excuse was ignorance before, but he's gone and he's studied those things, and instead of guarding the people from the dangers, he's chose rather to embrace it and enrich himself with that type of mindset.
Manipulate the nation, essentially.
I think it's very dangerous, and it's ethically to the highest extent wrong what he's doing. But then again, can you get judged in the court of ethics? And I think lastly, I think other parties will stay the same. I think COPE's on a downward slope. I don't see them doing very well. And a party I hope does well is the Freedom Front Plus. I think that's a direct pushback against land reform. I think if anyone wants to vote for a direct opposition to land reform, that's where they should put their vote, instead of these other parties who are sitting on the fence about the issue.
It's such an interesting time if you think about it. I mean, the Freedom Front Plus, who are openly, they say they're a minority group party, but people are literally clinging onto them just because of this one issue. And it's, I've heard a lot of people sharing your sentiment. It's fascinating, actually. I think often people say that South African politics, they say, no, it's boring. I mean, the ANC just win every election, but the point is, it's really not. It's such a dynamic environment, to be honest, and there really are big shifts. And I think if you start seeing it for what it truly is, if you start seeing the fact that the ANC might dip below 60% in this coming election, it's massive. It's not just another boring ANC victory. It's a huge shift, and I think for me, at least as a political junkie, it's super exciting.
Yeah, I agree. It's nice to see that there is some change, and there's a bit more sharing when it comes to the votes and that, and everyone's getting a bit more votes away from the ANC, which gives them a bit more power and mandate to do follow through with their plans and frameworks and that. So it's good to see that there is, if anything, it's just good to see that the ANC is losing votes.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. I think for me, you speak about what a rich, beautiful, democratic situation it is here. Obviously, we have freedom of speech. You're going back and forth now. We've heard them speak about emulating the China system. Does that mean not allowing us to do this? So I think it's a great thing.
Definitely. Guys, so for the listeners that aren't already on social media and on your podcast platforms, where can they find you? Where can they go read your stuff? And where can they more specifically find your podcast?
Well, they can find us on Twitter, the North-South Podcast, and on Facebook and on Instagram. I think we're under all those, just the North-South Podcast. And then our podcasts are available on pretty much all the major platforms, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. But if you go to any of our social media pages, we've got a link tree that will take you to any of your favorite podcast websites.
Awesome. Well, Fantastic. I think I'll recommend to all of our listeners that you definitely, you guys go have a look at their awesome podcast. It's definitely worth a look at. And then for Cheers listener, thank you for tuning in. We always appreciate your time. Please leave us a review on iTunes and SoundCloud and Facebook and all the wonderful places where you find your weekly dose of podcasts. And then we'll see you next time with the next interview.